everyone. My name is Liz Stein, and I am part of CAPOW, and we are talking about Yamhill County waters. And we are having education community meetings every third Tuesday of the month at 6:30 at the Carnegie room here at the McMinnville Public Library. And our first guest speaker is Luke Westphal, and he is the coordinator of the Greater Yamhill Watershed Council. And I'm going to let him say a few words.
It's a mouthful. No, it's a pleasure to be here with CAPOW and the community members that are attending our presentation. You know, we're here to share what we know and also what we don't know about our local watershed, our natural resources and habitats. So we'll be talking about fish and streams and rivers, oaks and prairies, and all the people and places that make up this local community that we call home.
And this Thursday, we are having another community meeting regarding the solutions to our Yamhill County Board of Directors and whether or not we want it to be a 5-commission board or what we would like that to look like.
If you want to learn more about the Watershed Council, we host our monthly meetings with our Board of Directors every first Tuesday of the month in this room, in the Carnegie room at the McMinnville Library. 6 p.m. pizza and social half hour, and then from 6:30 to 8:30 we'll talk about projects, funding, and where we go from here.
There you go. Tuesday's the magic day. The first Tuesday and the third Tuesday. Thanks, everyone.
The legislation proposes an amendment to the Oregon Constitution declaring that people have the inalienable and fundamental right of local community self-government in each county, city, town, or other municipality, and allowing certain local laws to preempt state or federal law, provided such local laws do not restrict fundamental rights of natural persons, their local communities, or nature. As one of our first steps, we decided that we needed to get educated, and we hope to educate more people along with us. So this is our first of what we hope will be several monthly presentations about water issues, and we are very happy to have Luke Westphal with us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me out. We're going to start you out with the acronyms and alphabet soup list. So welcome, thank you everyone for coming out tonight for this State of the Watershed presentation. Annalie and Joni had asked me to come to talk about what we know and also what we don't know about our local waters, our fish, and our wildlife. These are the topics that we're going to try to get through today. A little bit about me. I grew up outside of McMinnville, southwest of town, off of Masonville Road, next door to the McCabe Chapel Church and South Hill Cemetery on our family century farm. Some of you might see your properties on this map. Graduated 05 from Mac High, go Grizzlies, I'm a youngin'. Graduated 010 with a BA in Earth and Environmental Studies from Willamette University in Salem and a minor in Geography. Almost triple majored in Geology and Archaeology. My advisor was a geoarchaeologist, so I took all his classes, but I couldn't afford another year of loans. 2007 to 2012, worked for Stormwater Department, City of Salem Public Works. Bottom of the totem pole guy, but got to work on urban creeks, outreach, small-scale habitat restoration, and basically ran college crews during the summer where we walked 50 miles of urban creekway, cutting our way through the Blackberry to pull out all the trash and recyclables. Fortunate enough since 2012 to have joined the Greater Yamhill Watershed Council as the executive director of your local watershed council. And until I think maybe a year and a half ago, I was also on the board of directors of the 501c3 nonprofit that advocates for and tries to provide resources for all 100 plus watershed councils in Oregon, which we'll see in a minute. So our first objective is to kind of get a common language. We'll start with what's a watershed, and the immediate picture, right, is the pump house, the well house, buckets of water. But in this context, those two words are together. What we're looking at is a geographic term, and what it means, it's all of the landmass that when precipitation comes down based on topography and slope, that precipitation will move one way or the other. For a specific water body, be it a stream, river, lake, or ocean, we call the watershed that drains to that specific water body the watershed of that stream. But it's really just defined by topography. So Here we are at the Mac Library in the Carnegie room. There's a watershed of the stormwater pipes that are draining the gutters, the roof, and the parking lot of this small little campus. So we could argue that there's a watershed that drains this little circle. It's not in and of itself. That watershed, like all urban watersheds, is going to drain following gravity to the most immediately adjacent creek, which in our case is right behind us, Cozine Creek in Lower City Park. So we are standing in both the Mac Library watershed, as well as being a small component of a larger Cozine Creek watershed that starts out Hill Road, Old Sheridan Road, Peavine Road, right? But we can think bigger than that. Cozine, past Linfield College and the post office, drains into the Yamhill River. They call it the South Yamhill at that point. So we are also part of the Yamhill River at this moment. Of course, the Yamhill at Lafayette Locks drains into the Willamette. The Willamette drains into the outrageously enormous Columbia Basin. And of course, the Columbia drains into the Pacific. Take a moment and think about this, that right now, standing here, we are engaged and interconnected to 6 different watersheds, as small as the Mac Library campus and as big as the North American portion of the contributions to the Pacific Ocean. We're all different watersheds, different scales, but all interconnected in one way or another. So geographically speaking, that's what a watershed is. It's a topographically defined drainage area. They also call it a basin. But to environmental groups, to natural resource practitioners, it means so much more. And I think to a lot of the people in the room, it's not just this topographically defined area, it's everything within that area. It's the entire human experience of the communities, the physical dynamics, the social dynamics, the economic dynamics, the political aspects of that entire community within that drainage. And we're all connected by these topographically defined drainages, right? So it's all of us. It's the people, it's the plants, it's the farmers, it's the cities. We're all interconnected through this drainage. Watershed councils were not unique to Oregon. They occur across the whole world. But what is unique to Oregon is the state's investments in watershed councils. Watershed councils are these grassroots, community-led organizations that do 2 things. We identify local natural resource concerns, and we'll talk about what those might be, and we work toward voluntary community-based solutions. The reason that all of these watershed councils exist is that starting in the late 80s and then through the 90s, the state decided to make investments. They allocated originally general fund funds and governor's budget money, and then eventually were able to secure, through Measure 66 and 76, 7% of the Oregon lottery revenue goes toward funding local grassroots organizations called watershed councils, as well as projects that councils and any environmental organization or natural resource group or agency would like to pursue. So of that 7%, state parks actually gets half of it to do whatever they want with. And then the other 3.5% goes to OWEB, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, to be allocated out in competitive grants, very competitive grants. So there's more than 100 watershed councils that have formed, but in terms of the operational funding that the OWEB offers every 2 years, only 60 to 70% of us get funded every cycle. So super competitive. The goal, though, is that every square mile of the state will be covered by a local watershed council. Depending on where you are on the coast, you might work for a watershed council and do a lot with estuaries. On the central east side, you might be doing irrigation canals that you're piping so that they don't lose water. Or you might be working with dryland farmers or desert ranchers. But what unites all of us are these 2 things. All of us are working toward improvements for habitat for fish and wildlife, all the way down to lowly plants and macroinvertebrates and insects, up to more charismatic species like salmon and trout. We're also united in a pursuit of the most basic element of life, which is water. We want to ensure that our local communities have abundant clean water for all uses, whether it be recreational, irrigation for farms, drinking waters for municipalities and rural residencies, as well as adequate water at the right times and of good enough quality that our aquatic organisms and fish can thrive. So that unites all of these watershed councils across the state, although we might work in different types of ecosystems. We also all share a common thread of working with landowners who work the land. So these are your farms, these are your forests, these are your ranches. On the coast, you might be working with folks who do oyster operations and and things of that nature. But these are the primary folks that we're working with in the Willamette Valley and in the greater Yamhill Valley. And so what we understand is that working the land in a way that is sustainable for generation after generation after generation benefits all of us. And so it approaches your bottom lines as a working land owner or operator, and it also serves to benefit the public good of ensuring quality habitat. And of course we work in urban areas, rural towns such as the Yamhill County and northern Polk County where we operate. So let's get in local. Here's the Greater Yamhill Watershed Council. Our mission is to protect, restore, and monitor the quality of our local natural resources. That's what we achieve to do. We are defining ourselves by the topography of the Yamhill and Chehalem valleys, which we'll show you. And the mechanism that we want to achieve this through is collaborative, community-based, and voluntary solutions. So that already distinguishes us from other types of environmental groups you might be familiar with, such as Sierra Club or even some river keepers groups. We do not use involuntary actions, which might be things like that rely on compliance and enforcement. So we don't do reporting. We don't use litigation. Those are not mechanisms that within our mission, we are excluding those from our tool set. So we coined this term, this Greater Yamhill Watershed term. What we call the Greater Yamhill Watershed is the Yamhill Valley, Chehalem Valley, and Grand Island and Lambert Slough. But what do we have in the Yamhill here? The majority of your map is the Yamhill Valley, the Yamhill River watershed. It's draining 7 subbasins. You might think of them as 7 tributaries. You've got the North and South Yamhill. You've got the Yamhill where after the North and South combined. And then you've got Mill Creek, Willamette Creek, Deer Creek, and Salt Creek. So 7 subbasins make up one river valley. And you know, who else was going to work in Chehalem Valley? Maybe Tualatin, but maybe our group grabbed it up first in the 90s. I don't know. But we work in the Chehalem Valley. So that's one subbasin with a bunch of different named creeks. Chehalem Creek, Hess Creek, Springbrook Creek, and Harvey Creek. Totally separate system, drains directly into the Willamette, has no ties to the Yamhill. But it's the adjacent watershed, and more than likely, if this county line was down here, Chehalem would be part of the Tualatin Watershed Council, or maybe even the River Keepers would have picked it up. And then again, who was going to service Grand Island or Lambert Slough? It made sense for us to work on that. It's on this side of the Willamette. So it's not a tributary, it's not a river system, it's just a side channel that has formed on the Willamette. It's a simplification, but we can kind of pare down our watershed into 3 major land uses. We've got this urban corridor, which basically follows the highways, which basically follow the river, because it follows the low point. We've got 10 incorporated cities, a handful of unincorporated cities, including Grand Ronde. McMinnville is the county seat, and Metro is expanding. Eugene, Corvallis are expanding. We have pressure from the north and the south, but primarily from the north. These are 2035 population estimates from the Portland State University. Taken with a grain of salt, sometimes the numbers are a little bumped. There's various reasons for why. But McMinnville by 2035 could have a 52% increase and a 50,000 total population. Newburgh would be hit harder because they're closer to Portland Metro. 69% increase by 2035, 38,000 total population by that time. Yamhill County a couple years ago had just hit the 100,000 mark for population, estimated by 2035 to be up to 142,000 population. So think about the pressure that puts on our natural resources. Think about the pressure that puts on our communities to expand. How do we do that? Where do we find the land? We've already got a lot of high value farmland being converted for other uses. How do we preserve that farmland? How do we preserve our forests while also allowing for expansion of our urban area? Of course, forestry, and this is a generalization, there's forestry everywhere, but predominantly it's happening in the Coast Range, in the hills of the Coast Range. And when we look at some maps of historic vegetation from the 1850s, same thing, although it's definitely expanded after we stopped the fire regimes of the Calapooya. So this is primarily where you're getting your timber. So when we're working in the upper North Yamhill, upper Deer Creek, upper Willamette, upper South, and almost all of Mill Creek. We're working with small woodlands and industrial timber lands. And then of course agricultural diversity. If I go to places like Walla Walla or the South Umpqua, I got guys that grow apples, and I can sit them all down and we can talk about the same chemicals, the same practices, the same schedules. This is a nightmare. It's wonderful, but from a practitioner standpoint, the diversity and the activities that happen on the landscape is incredible. We've got a lot of production in seed crops, whether it's grass seed, A lot of cover crop seed is being grown here, sent to the Midwest where it rains in the summer, and they have to have cover on their crops to prevent erosion. We have droughty summers, so we don't need to necessarily keep that seed, although there's a burgeoning class of farmers that are doing those kind of things. Trestle crops, we're the vineyard capital of the state. Thankfully, most of those vineyards are salmon safe certified. It's a water quality and erosion control certification. Also have a lot of caneberries and blueberries here. We used to be the walnut capital in the area. I'd say we're now on the rise to be the hazelnut capital. If you've seen some of the figures of what's being put in just the last few years, it's pretty astronomical, and a lot of different reasons. They've developed blight resistance, probably from OSU, and then some of the markets crashed, I think, in Turkey, where they've had some problems with disease or other issues that make our crops more valuable. Lots of hay and pasture and ranches. We've got some of the biggest, highest producing nurseries in the Willamette Valley. Monrovia, Bailey, to name a few, Carlton Plant, and very progressive nurseries if you get a chance to tour them. And much less so than when folks were starting to settle here. There's really not fruits and vegetables anymore. We've certainly got CSAs, we've got small organic crops, but most of the fruits and vegetables, and definitely call me out if I'm wrong, but we don't really have it in the same acreage as all these other types of crops. Although Sam Sweeney will say we used to be the prune capital of the state too. So everything changes. It's all based on markets and weather and who's gonna buy what I got. So just a briefest history lesson of the last 15,000 years. Thank you, Washington and Idaho. This is a picture of the scablands. Thank you for your soil. For those that don't know, 15,000 years ago, this is what the Willamette Valley looked like. It was the end of the Pleistocene Ice Age. The valley was run over with taller than URI ground sloths, antique bison, mammoths and mastodons. If anybody wants to go discover bones and tusks, there's a guy named Mike Fuller on the South Yamhill. He's looking for volunteers to go out and get in the water with him, and you'll find stuff. It's incredible. If you want to hang out with him, talk to me after. So yeah, basically in Missoula, Montana, back at 15,000 years ago, we had a big lake. As glaciers were receding, I think the estimate's like 13 times the size of an annual discharge of the Amazon River, something like that. It's huge. So this grew. It took many thousands of years, many millennia, to build up that amount of water. And then starting at about 13,000 BC and running for 2,000 years, we had 40 cataclysmic Noah's Ark level floods. And they scoured, this is a little GIF, a little animation. It scoured out parts of Idaho and Washington and Oregon. We actually have a lot of data on this. We can make maps of how far up. Red is the biggest flood, estimated at 400 feet. Some studies say 500. But look, we went all the way up Willamette Creek Road with that big flood. We went up Moores Valley Road, Gopher Valley Road. This thing inundated. If there were any tribal camps 15,000 years ago, they would have been wiped out down here and run for the hills. And at a presentation here a few weeks ago, they said they actually have some stories of running for the hills. So maybe not at the beginning of these floods, but maybe near the end of that 2,000-year cycle. Of course, how would we know? Their camps were probably wiped out. It brought with them these beautiful glacial erratic rocks, which this is our remaining monument. Please don't think it was this small to begin with. We've all been chipping away at it for decades. But they're everywhere and well documented at different elevations. And of course, it deposited the fine soils that are the entire reason that you or I are in this room today, that the Calapooya settled this area, that the Europeans invaded the area. It's fertile. There's also really good soils in the hills that don't have anything to do with Missoula. And in some capacities, they're bad soils, but they're great soils for vineyards. So zooming through, our best estimates are about 10,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago is when the Calapooya were in the valley. And they persisted for millennia until the 1840s. And during those millennia, they managed their ecosystem. This was not a park-like area on its own. It was intensively managed by low controlled burns, the kind of burns that you could walk through. And they burned for things like tarweed, large majestic oaks. The way that they managed the landscape produced oak savannas that had maybe 1 to 4 giant oak trees, umbrella-shaped, broccoli-shaped oak trees, producing a ton of acorns. One 100-plus-year-old tree could produce enough acorns for a multi-generational family. So you didn't need that many. And of course, along the bigger river systems and creeks, they're too wet to really burn. So what we ended up with was mixed woodlands, oaks, maples, cottonwoods, ash, willow. Not entirely closed off forests, a lot of shade, but also a lot of dappled shade, so a lot of understory, a lot of habitat in these bottomland river forests. Of course, the Oregon oak was the lifeblood species. This is a really cool map. I hope you guys enjoy this one. When I found this data set, I got pretty giddy. This is based off of surveyor records and other historical records of 1850s and a little bit before and a little bit after. And they basically reconstructed for the entire Willamette Valley what the vegetation communities look like. They even got it down to like, was it roamer's fescue or was it like types of grasses? So this is a broader generalization than the data set would even allow. You can get a much finer scale. But look where we settled. We found these beautiful park-like grass prairies. So Yamhill, Carlton, Lafayette, Dayton, McMinnville, you know, these were open grasslands. Newburgh a little less so, I'm not sure why, maybe topographically based. There's a lot of wetlands in Newburgh too, in Chehalem. You can actually see where Cosine is in town. It's this mixed woodland. That's where the burn really didn't take. And you've got this mix of oaks and ash and maples. You go down to Linfield College where they've got 12 acres of floodplain. It's a mix. Of course, European settlement starting in the 1840s. We start to see infrastructure built. We start to see the end of the fire regimes allowing Douglas fir and other conifers to invade before they were burned out. So that was our briefest history lesson that we could do for today. We're current. And now we're starting to think, okay, this isn't Calipuya land anymore. It's not necessarily wild country, so who owns this place? This is not unique to us, this is not unique to the United States, but 90+% of our watersheds, of our river systems in general, are under private land ownership. In our area, we have a little bit of influence from federal properties. These purples, they might show up as pink on your map, is the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, which kind of gets a mix of woodlands and other types of habitats that are under their purview. These guys are wonderful partners for doing fish habitat projects. They've got resources for helping you with engineering and permitting. They're able to provide large pieces of wood from thinning operations that they do and sustainable harvests that they do. Wonderful partners. So that's in the upper North Yamhill, upper Willamina, a little bit in upper Deer, and then a good chunk of upper Mill Creek is our BLM influence. You got a little bit of corner of U.S. Forest Service. This is probably is this the Van Duzer? Susla, thank you. I haven't worked with these guys yet, but I'm sure there'll be some interaction soon. And then this hatch mark here below the U.S. Forest Service is the current reservation of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. It's not their historic, and I should have brought a map of their ancestral lands because it touches into the coast, goes all the way up to Portland. It's huge, and we often think, oh, Grand Ronde Reservation. There's so much more to their history and their influence. So, and then there's little dapples of state. This is probably the Carlton Wildlife Refuge, which is more or less defunct. You've got some kind of dilapidated state parks up here. This is probably Mission Mill, and then this little sliver down here is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is like the tiny bit of topography that drains in our area for the Basket Slough. Our primary partners when we're talking about non-private is going to be cities, counties, and then the BLM and the tribes. That's who we primarily work with if it's not a private landowner. Now we'll kind of move on to some priority habitats and wildlife. Obviously there's way more out there than oak and prairie and streams and rivers, but for the sake of today we're not going to get into wetlands. We're not really going to get into forestry outside of the overlap with oak. I only have a couple slides on oak. It's mostly on waterways and water. So oak savanna, again, this was the historic, co-evolved, multi-millennial ecosystem that existed here. This is what the Yamhill Valley, this is what McMinnville looked like. In the Willamette Valley, we had more than a million acres of this type of habitat. We are now down to less than 1% of that historic range. Fortunately for us, in the greater Yamhill area, Polk County and Yamhill County have some of the largest intact historic remnant woodlands of oak and prairie, mostly oak. It's really tough to find good prairie anymore. And again, on that map, you'll see that we handed out of our historic veg, it was about 30% of our local acres were this habitat, so a significant portion. Something of note is that a lot of our funding is tied to habitats with connections to endangered species. So with the Oak Prairie, we actually have a beautiful Fender's blue butterfly. It only exists in the Willamette Valley. There are some caveats, but it basically only persists on one species of lupin, the Kincaid's lupin, which is also itself threatened. We should have a lot of local pride in the Fender's blue. It was discovered outside of McMinnville in the 1930s. It's named, Fender's blue butterfly is named after Kenneth Fender. Sometimes you'll go to the Native Plant Society meetings or other meetings here and you'll meet his daughter, Laura McMaster. She still lives in the same century house in town by Linfield College and became a renowned local educator on the environment. So we should have a lot more pride in this little struggling butterfly and a lot more awareness of it. So one of the things that we were able to do, in part because we have these large remnant tracts of oak and prairie, we have Fender's blue in our area, we were able to get a $2 million 5-year grant from the federal government to assist agricultural producers with remnant oak and prairie to do practices on the ground to improve habitat, whether the butterfly or the lupin was there or not, but preferably scored a lot higher if they were there. So it was things like killing the blackberries, restoring the understory to native grasses and wildflowers, cutting down all the doghair oaks that were crowding each other out so that you leave just enough oaks that over time they'll turn into that umbrella broccoli-shaped oak that provides habitat. Those thin doghair oaks don't provide habitat. It reduces the acorn production by a significant factor, removing encroaching fir and other trees like that. So a lot of money has been spent in our area because we're a priority for these types of habitat and this species in general. So the Yamhill River, when we look at Willamette Valley wide, we are the largest tributary coming from the west side. So of all the coastal drained, rain-fed, no snowpack river systems contributing to the Willamette, we're the largest. We've got 360 miles of known or estimated habitat for trout and salmon. More than half of those streams, as you'll see, are listed for one or more pollutants as water quality limited. And in a lot of cases, to meet the standards of water quality that have been set, we really lack sufficient buffers, vegetation or forests along our waterways, whether it be creeks or rivers, road ditches, or even ag ditches, or any type of conveyance of water to really meet the goals that we have at a regulatory sense. This is probably the best good news slide I have for you guys. You've got fish, and some of them are doing pretty darn well. For the rap sheet that the Yamhill River gets, you should be super excited and proud of ourselves for what habitat we're providing. So they're non-native, they're considered wild and naturalized, and wild genetics. But we receive up to 38 to 48% of all of the coho salmon that come up the Willamette Valley above Oregon City. These are pictures from upper North Yamhill, a female and a male. They get one chance to spawn, and that's it. A lot of times when we find female carcasses, we'll open them up, and the egg sacs look to be almost completely full. So they didn't get a chance to lay a red. So that's one of the things that we look at is, did they get the chance to reproduce, even though they made it up to the natal creek. Numbers for endangered species native to here are a lot lower. They're really going to the Cascades. Our populations are considered dependent on the east side tributaries. So we're learning every year a little bit more about our steelhead numbers, but a good guess would be about 5 to 10%. An average run year is about 5,000 fish. So we could say about 500 fish, 500 steelhead come to the entire Yamhill's watershed. Not that many, and they're hard to find. We don't really get spawning activity for Chinook salmon. This is really just juveniles trying to escape higher flows, maybe find colder water. We do have some really cold water, good cold water refuges in the Yamhill area. And you'll see a map on the next page. Oh, why don't we just pass it out now? This is a map of your salmon and trout. It doesn't break it out into rearing or spawning. I do have that data. But basically rearing is in the lower areas and spawning's in the forested hills where gravels can be found more plentiful. We've got resident coastal cutthroat trout. Supposedly we don't have any sea run. And the populations are supposed to be strong enough that they're in enough creeks and rivers in our basin that they're not considered a threatened species. And then recently, I think last year, ODFW did some surveys on willing private land ownership in Salt Creek and found some Oregon chub. Oregon chub was the very first species of the entire Endangered Species Act that was officially delisted entirely, taken off the entire list. And a lot of that had to do with finding more and more populations than we thought. So be super proud, us Greater Yamhillians, of the water resources that are providing this wonderful fish habitat and fish populations. So what we have here again is a combination of spawning and rearing habitat. Your spring chinook is in the red. So they're really just sticking to the bottomlands. These aren't spawning, they're just rearing, mostly juveniles escaping high flows, maybe looking for colder water. Your coho salmon are in purple. You'll note that for whatever reason, the steelhead are believed to be cut off kind of down here, and the coho will continue up, probably because it's a lazy creek. And coho really like those low gradients, and steelhead really like high gradients. Basically, all of these timber areas are providing, if we broke out the spawning versus rearing, it's really the timber areas that are providing the quality habitat for spawning. And then, you know, the lower gradient areas are where agriculture, where they're going to try and rear during the summer. And there's really not much gravel in those lower areas. So one of the things that was asked for this presentation might be to include some information on what's a healthy creek, what's a healthy river. So one of the things that makes a really healthy river is vegetation. Vegetation alongside a waterway, whether it's a creek, a river, a ditch, or a roadside, is going to have a marked increase in water quality compared to a lot of the other things that we can do that are a lot more expensive and don't work for us. Vegetation grows for us. This is a meta-analysis that I can't remember the group that did it, but they looked at different riparian buffer studies. They tried to figure out what might be the average pollutant reductions based on different buffer widths, looking at pesticides in particular. So what you see here is going from a 17-foot buffer to a 67-foot buffer. There's a diminishing gain, right? Within the first, let's round up, 20 feet of buffer, you get an average of 50% reduction in pesticides entering that waterway. Not bad. 20-foot buffer, half of your pollution's cut, on average. And if we double that to 33 feet, we get all the way up to an average of 90% reduction. And then we hit our curve. Even if we doubled that to 67 feet, we've only gotten to 97% reduction. So do you guys know how sometimes when you're listening to the news or you're looking at maybe some environmental reports on parks and things like that, maybe someone's trying to protect the national park and keep buffers? Well, some people will say, I want a 200-foot buffer on all creeks and rivers. Part of the reason they might be saying that is that their threshold for the amount of pollution they're willing to tolerate is really low. And they want to get it down to the smallest number that they know possible. Well, what if we need more buy-in? What if we need an approach that has compromise and might attract more folks to participate and actually get something done on the ground? Well, when we do federal contracts with CREP, might not be on your acronym list, it's a federal program to pay farmers to put in riparian buffers. I believe the minimum requirement is about 35 feet. You could go up to 200 if you want, but you don't need to. And in some cases, it's not even recommended. So it depends on what your pollution threshold is. How many dandelions are you willing to tolerate in your lawn? That kind of cost-benefit analysis. So in general, you know, I'm working on all sorts of stuff that's less than 10 feet, but it's something, and especially on bare slopes, we're getting some marked improvements on erosion and incision and things of that nature. So might not filter pollutants as well as a 17-foot buffer, but we're doing something. The other thing that a lot of people might not realize is what a healthy river looks like. So we've got the stream side, we got that pat down. Let's have diverse, dense, varying width vegetative buffers. That's a good water quality goal. But what does the actual stream channel need to look like? Real rivers have curves. They have curves and bends, right? And sometimes they bend so far it cuts the channel off and makes a little oxbow. We have diversity of the in-stream elevations and the type of sediments and deposits that are on the stream bed, forming riffles and runs and pools. And pools might provide cooler water, constantly circulating depending on the depth of the pool. Healthy waters have active floodplains. So a lot of times when we're in a developed area, we see these V-shaped, what we'd call an incised creek or river. At no point in the year when it rains does the water get high enough to cross over the bank. We would call that an inactive floodplain. We would call that a disconnected floodplain. And you're losing all the benefits of what streams and rivers do for depositing sediments. But we do that for a reason. We have infrastructure, we have property, we have all these things that we've built, sometimes right up to the creek edge. And so there's conflict there that has to be looked at. We can't just require setbacks, as an example. You know, that would have big influences. I think a lot of kayakers may or may not know is that a healthy creek or river is not enjoyable for a kayaker. They are full of wood. There's a couple pieces of wood in here. I don't know about that. I'd copy and paste this with Photoshop and just fill it. A healthy river or creek has a lot of wood. Not all creeks or rivers historically had wood, but a lot of people think that we put wood in the creeks because it provides cover and a place for fish to hide. That's great. That's an ancillary benefit. But what largewood does is the same thing that a beaver dam does. It slows the water down. It changes the hydrology, and over decades and centuries, it will change the geomorphology of that creek. It will meander a creek that was once straight. It will reactivate your floodplain by slowing water down enough to get gravels to build up behind it. It'll build pools, riffles, and runs because as that gravel accumulates, it has a drop now. And so now there's a pool after your piece of wood, and then it turns into maybe a riffle or a run depending on the gravel that's in there. So on the stream side, the most important thing that you could do for water quality is plant your buffers, kill the weeds, maintain the weeds, get them gone in the long term so that, and then if you got the money or the permitting, we really do this in the forested timberland areas because you don't have problems with private property. But if you can put wood in the creek or river, that's the other next best thing you could do. It will reactivate ancient geomorphological processes of creating meanders and building up your stream bed. It'll take you from a bare bedrock to, you know, one of our sites on Gooseneck had like 2 or 3 feet of gravel accumulation in I think 1 or 2 seasons. It's astounding. So those two things combined, if you're trying to improve water quality, improve your watershed, and make better fish habitat, those are the two things, and they're both wood-based. They're both vegetation-based, right? They're just costly. A lot of times we go out with folks looking for fish, and we get to this part of the upper North Yamhill with these beautiful alders and ash and willows, and we go, oh my God, this is a beautiful riparian area. And from our perspective, it is. These are early adopters. They're the first ones to come in after a clear cut. But when we passed our forest laws, we didn't enact any rules that say within areas that predate the law that those riparian areas need to be replanted. So what established there are trees that when they die and fall in the creek, they don't last as long as our conifers do in providing habitat and affecting geomorphology. They last maybe 10, 15, 20 years if you're lucky. You put some nice old growth, nice diameter firs or cedars in there, they're gonna stay and they won't decompose. And they're gonna build up your stream bed, build up your floodplain. So this is beautiful, but what we would do in here is we'd call it conifer enrichment. Come in and plant a whole bunch of western red cedar, whatever we can get to grow that's not deciduous. Here's an example of natural wood recruitment. So this is the North Yamhill near the headwaters. This was the normal river flow. And then in one winter season, I think it was one winter event, this tree fell down, blocked the whole channel, forced the water to move this way, slowed the water down, accumulated a whole bunch of wood, developed this giant pool here, nice riffle here, and then deposited all this wonderful gravel. So we found tons of coho spawning in these gravels. It was nice and slow. This is the kind of thing that we could spend tens of thousands of dollars doing with grant money. So when we see it happen on its own, we get really excited. Or when we see beavers doing stuff like this, we get really excited. This is what restores our watersheds from a geomorphological standpoint. Water quality. This is probably one of the hardest subjects to talk about just because there's a lot more unknowns than knowns. But we're going to give you guys the best knowledge that we have currently available. Point source pollution, I can point at it. That's literally it. I can definitively define that is the source of the pollutant. So typically it's a pipe, it's a wastewater system from your city that treats the water and then puts clean water back in the river. A lot of times that elevates the temperature. Other times it has higher elevations of estrogen from our pharmaceuticals and all sorts of things in it. Discharge from God knows what. Point source is something that's been regulated very heavily. State and Fed programs, Clean Water Act have really tackled this problem in a very significant and positive way. And I'd recommend anybody wanting to learn more about what it looked like before we really got a handle on point source pollution. Google Tom McCall's 1962 Pollution in Paradise, where he just rips apart the Willamette River for being so polluted. And of course, Tom McCall, Republican, became Oregon's leading environmental champion and state governor from 66 to 75. Pretty amazing guy. So again, point source, not entirely fixed, but relatively to non-point, we've got a lot more work to do on non-point source pollution. So non-point means I might be able to point at, this car's leaking oil, this horse may or may not have a muddy contribution to a creek nearby, this creek might need taller vegetation to really provide shade, or this field drain to a right-of-way. We can point to those, but maybe this isn't too high of a pollution that it reaches a water quality standard, but me and my neighbor and all the other thousands of cars might add up to a cumulative impact. That's one way to look at this non-point source pollution. In some cases you're able to point at, but you might not be able to say that just because I see this and the river is muddy looking, I can't say that this was the reason or this was the cause. It'd have to be really definitive. Like you'd have to go out there crystal clear, upstream of your property, total mud below. That might be something we could argue as a point source. So a lot of different sources. These are the most common. Roads and right-of-ways, big issue for water quality, non-point source pollution. Bare and exposed unvegetated ground, whether it's slopes or flat, that's one of our biggest contributors is bare exposed ground, and ground that, even if it is covered, doesn't have significant root mass underneath. Unshaded or unvegetated watersides, again, it could be a ditch, a right-of-way, a creek or a river. Livestock, even folks with small operations, if you got 3 or 4 horses on an acre, we can calculate how much manure every animal is going to contribute on a daily basis. Where's that manure going? How close do you allow them to waterways or potential waterways when it's really running, when stormwater's happening? So it's not just large operations for livestock, it's even folks who may only have a few acres. It's their dream farm and we just load it with animals because we love animals. A lot of those folks might not even know that they're potentially contributing to water quality problem. Septic systems is a big one, non-point source pollution, especially in rural areas. How many people in this room who have a septic tank know where it is? How many people know the last time you pumped it? How many know the schedule you're supposed to pump it on? Do you know where your drain field is? Did you put your horses over the drain field? These are all questions that a lot of times, especially new, but certainly prior rural landowners may or may not know. And we even have septic tanks in town here in McMinnville that are not connected to the normal sewer system. So, and of course other things, dumping trash, obviously. It's hard to point those places out unless it's a concentrated area. And then please don't flush any of your pharmaceuticals. It's amazing what they do to fish and amphibians. They can't get that stuff out when they treat our water at the sewage treatment plant. That stuff does not come out. The estrogen, all these other things, it's not something we have a means to do. Runoff is basically, when people talk about non-point source pollution, that's the big one that a lot of people talk about. Runoff comes in a lot of different forms. Impact erosion, so this is the most basic view. This is soil. When rain hits soil, each individual drop, if we could zoom in with our microscope, we'd be making these dents and moving particles. When we get enough of that, it turns into a sheet. When we get even more, it might start creating what we call rills, actual divots in the landscape. And if it gets significant enough, if you might have grassy knoll but no root structure, you might end up creating a new creek or a new ditch, and we call that gully erosion. So where this happens is most of the time if your soil's bare. Even if it's covered, like here we've got some kind of grassy cover, but it's lacking root structure. There's nothing underneath. You might be preventing some of the splash impact, but nothing to keep your soil intact once a divot's been made. Vegetation, again, is really the key here to water quality when we're talking about non-point source pollution, especially runoff. This is the best summary of available data for what are the pollutants and where do we have creeks that are listed for at least one or more pollutants. So that's what this map is. I'm going to pass around a data table that goes with this. This shows you the pollutants, the waterways that are listed as water quality impaired for those pollutants. Sorry. So I've just picked a couple of the pollutants. I picked out E. coli and temperature. Know that what this map is showing is based on data that's been collected. This map could be entirely red or entirely blue if we had current data on every single drainage, on every single creek. So some of this data could be 10, 15 years old. There's a lot of caveats when we're looking at water quality data we gotta be aware of. Nothing is definitive when we talk about water quality. There's no black and white, it is all gray. So let's just look at E. coli bacteria, common sources again, livestock, manure piles. They can actually DNA source your bacteria. So the city of Tualatin paid a whole bunch of money to test the Tualatin, and they found that their bacteria came from geese. What are you gonna do about geese? They're basically destroying farmers' crops and then pooping. I don't know if they ever figured out the problem, but at least they knew what the bacteria was from. Pet waste. I heard an example, I think out of Clackamas. They had these outrageous numbers. They tracked it down to one guy who was every day, multiple times a day, taking his dog poopy bags and putting them down the storm. And it was enough. One person doing that frequently enough was enough to show elevated E. coli in a small, probably had low flow. Maybe if there was more water, you wouldn't notice. But and for septic systems and sewer systems that, no pipe lasts forever, they all have a shelf life. Based on the data that's been collected, which means that Salt Creek, potentially no E. coli data has been collected. Mill Creek, potentially no E. coli data has been collected. What we know is of the data that's been collected, these red lines have exceeded a water quality standard for surface water for E. coli bacteria. And it was enough years collected with professional methods using, E. coli takes labs, you have to take them to a lab, using a certified lab. So this is vetted data. These red lines are where certain times of the year you're gonna have the potential for E. coli to be above a standard. Now on your sheet, when you look at E. coli, it probably tells you the affected use. So some of the uses that were affecting fish, some of it were affecting plankton. E. coli, I tagged this one because it affects us. E. coli is public recreation. So water contact with the water body. You'd have to get into the data to figure out, is this summertime E. coli, is it fall, is it winter? That's why you've got this yellow overlapping a red. Maybe the red is summertime E. coli. Definitively, we know based on current data that at that time it exceeded standards. But maybe in the spring or the fall, it's getting close or only exceeded a couple times. So we didn't list it as polluted, as water quality limited. You see this purple one over here with the ABC TMDL. That is a mechanism under the Clean Water Act. When we list a creek as water quality limited, the next process is the state Department of Environmental Quality and the federal EPA will partner together, and they will make a study identifying how much above standard for that pollutant is your water body. How much can all users add to that without exceeding the standard? And then they'll actually allocate out to all regulated bodies that could contribute E. coli allocations. You can contribute this much bacteria, you can contribute this much bacteria. So it's a multi-decadal process. It really gets tied up. We've been waiting for our Yamhill TMDL to regulate this and everything else on that list. It was supposed to be finished in '98. As taxpayers, we're just really not paying into DEQ at the level it needs. It would be my personal opinion. They need more resources to be able to implement the laws that exist and implement the policies and regulations. So that's this purple. Newburgh was captured as part of a larger Willamette River-wide TMDL regulatory plan. And so it actually has allocations that it's City shops has certain allocations, and the city community-wide is only able to contribute so much to that. But again, any of these could be different than what we're showing here because some of this data is old. Some of this data, depending on the pollutant, like pesticides, if you detect it once, it's on. And if you detect it once over a concentration, it makes the list. Well, what if I went out 20 times the next 10 years and I don't find it again? Should it still be on the list? So there's a lot of caveats to this data, but this is our best summary of what we know about E. coli bacteria in the Yamhill and Chehalis Valley. And now I'll end here with stream temperature for water quality. This is, obviously one of the most widespread issues that we have. In the green areas, this says insufficient data. So maybe I or a DEQ or a BLM rep or even a tribal staff member had collected maybe a year's worth of data, but maybe not even that. Maybe we only got a few months of data. And so it might have shown some elevated temperatures, but it wasn't good enough of a data set to really make any more of a determination. So there's a lot of that. And then all the blues, we just don't have any data collected or reported. Stream temperature is really going to be during the summer. This is when we need cold water. During the winter season, it's already cold. We've got abundant water and flow. Except for the last few years, we've had pretty dry winters. But for the most part, these water quality limitations are not year-round, but some of them will be. Most of them are going to be summer. Portions of the Chehalis Valley are already regulated under that Clean Water Act process for stream temperature. We can take a look again at some of the reasons why our stream temperatures are elevated. If we don't have shade over the creek, there's a high potential for those summer sunbeams, the solar radiation, to heat up the water column. Maybe you have enough shade, but there's no flow. It's really easy to heat up a small water body. Much like the rest of the Willamette Valley and the state of Oregon, this is what we call an over-allocated water resources system. So if everyone exercised their water right to the degree that they are permitted at the same time, the rivers would run dry. So thankfully we don't have that happen, but we do use a lot of water, and especially at some of the hardest times, like August, September, when flows are really low, crops really are desperate for irrigation. So sometimes we see elevated temperatures that maybe if you really figured out the problem, it would be lack of flow. Something that a lot of people don't think about, impoundment, dams and ponds, maybe not ones that are disconnected from the creek, but if they have any connection to the creek or river, those impoundments will stratify, get really hot water at the top, kind of colder as you go down to the bottom. When those spill over, what's the first thing to spill over typically is the hot water. These impoundments, they're there for a variety of good reasons, irrigation being a really high priority, but sometimes we have to kind of balance that, the need for impounding water on channel and the effects that might have. Right now we're trying to look a lot at how can we improve impoundment of water off channel that what can be used for irrigation, can be used for fighting wildfires. How can we make that process easier? What can the county do? And so I think in May we're actually going to potentially have some kind of first public meetings or something on that. We'll start to think more actively about how we could do that. A couple other things, urban heat island. If you could fly a drone over McMinnville on a hot summer day, you're probably going to see that all the ag lands around us are a lot cooler, and then all of these hot, black, impervious surfaces are just radiating heat. And whether that can reach the creek or not, sometimes on a really hot or even mildly warm temperature day, if we get some rain, that's going to heat up the water immediately, and as that discharges into pipes, it can be contributing already hot water. So there are these concerns of this urban heat island effect. And then channel simplification. This is really more important in ag and forestry areas, although certainly in urban, but that again gets back to rivers have curves, rivers have wood, rivers have vegetation. They're not straight ditches naturally. So all of that simplification, reduction of complexity can make changes to stream temperature. So the question is it getting better? Is it getting worse? That takes some hefty statistical resources and staff time, which we've never had the capacity to do. we rely on our partners at the DEQ, who again are pretty darn strapped. So there's probably 30 or 40 stations they could have looked at for this report, and we got data, a summary of the 3 that the DEQ runs, which are probably the best data in terms of they've had for the longest time. Basically what you're seeing here is a DEQ station on the South Yamhill, one on the North Yamhill, and then one after they combine. You're getting the broadest understanding of these pollutants from all of the South Yamhill contributions, all of the North Yamhill contributions, and then what do they look like together. Here's our legend at the top. If it's orange, we're not meeting the water quality standard. All of these are, over a 10-year period, are not meeting a water quality standard. If it's a slash mark, there's no trend. Some years it goes up, some years it goes down. We're not seeing either the results of our restoration project, nor the results of increased pressures and use of the land. Here's one with a down arrow, which you might hope is like pollution's going down. Well, they make the down arrow a trend toward degradation. A down arrow means bad, it's getting worse. To what degree? The report didn't say. To what magnitude? We don't know. We'd have to get into the data. But overall, over a 10-year period, for the North Yamhill, E. coli is becoming a bigger problem. Temperature, no trends, but nothing's meeting quality standard. Here's a couple greens. Parts hydrogen, a pH. It's kind of a good news, bad news. We're meeting standards on the north and south, but after they combine, something's going on. The effect of the combination, or maybe it's some other stuff coming in from up north, because there are other creeks that drain into the South Yamhill after they meet. But after they come together, it's not meeting standards for pH, and the trend is toward worse water quality. And then we end here with dissolved oxygen for our trend analysis. Dissolved oxygen is important for aquatic life. Without enough oxygen dissolved in the water column, life cannot persist. It's amazing that it does with some of the low levels that we find. All of these are not meeting standard, but again, no trends. We're not seeing anything getting better or worse. And these are the 4 pollutants I believe that were in the report. There could have been a couple more, I might have just left them out for time. I'm not going to get into this today, but we have been monitoring pesticides since 2007. This is even trickier to dissect the data, dissect the trends, and really come out with an effective message to you guys. It's been difficult. But for 2 years, we looked at 10 sites basin-wide, basically at the mouths of tributaries. So at the bottom of Salt Creek, the bottom of the North Yamhill. We're trying to gather the large impacts. And to be honest, the data for those 2 years, 10 sites, there wasn't too many bad problems. Some exceedances of concentrations, some herbicides exceeding, some fungicides, some insecticides, but nothing to really call our attention, nothing written on the wall saying our group needs to go here to learn more. So where we did find that was places with low flow, as you would expect. So if there's not much water, it's really easy to meet or exceed those benchmarks for water quality standards. So Cozine Creek, very low water, sensitive habitat because of that. And West Fork Palmer Creek, which is just south of Dayton off of Webfoot Road, kind of out by Stringtown Road and Lafayette Highway. So we've been doing these as kind of micro focus areas. Again, trend analysis has not been showing anything. And what we are finding is exceedances of things that it doesn't take a lot to reach the benchmark. So stuff like organophosphates, particularly insecticides like PLURIBUS. Maybe you guys have seen in the news. At the federal level, we're trying to ban. I think the EPA is trying to ban PLURIBUS. So it might end up that a regulatory action is going to end up addressing that exceedance through removing the ability of our producers to use that chemical. Our goal isn't necessarily to have that happen through these monitoring processes. We want our producers to have the tools that they need. But sometimes that's how these water quality standards end up being met, is that we, as a community, as a production community and ag community, those tools are now off the table. And there's some other ones that might happen to you. Diuron is a big one, especially in the Midwest. It's kind of saturating the atmosphere because they use it so much. Not so much here, but there's a lot of things that at very small concentrations can be detected and reach those benchmarks. I'm happy to talk more about that. So in terms of monitoring that's going on, pesticides is still going on. If you want to go out with me, every 2 weeks, March through October, we go to Cozine and then Palmer Creek, and we're starting a planning committee to open it back up to potentially the whole basin again. So you know, we're not really getting traction in these areas for change. We're not really seeing trends, so we want to open it back up. Thank you, Anna. The other thing we are currently doing for monitoring is temperature. It's pretty cheap and affordable to do temperature. The probes are donated by DEQ and BLM and the city of Newburgh. So we've got all the creeks in city of Newburgh monitored upstream of town and downstream, so we can get the footprint of the temperature change that the city's contributing. We do that for McMinnville as well. And then we, you know, because these are BLM probes, we have to do some that are a tie to our BLM properties. So we do some monitoring of land use changes in Mill Creek. We put one at the end of forestry, and then we put one at the end of ag before it goes in to the river. So we can kind of do a best guess of what contributions might be happening. You'd be surprised how, you know, over a couple miles or more than a couple miles, over, you know, a dozen miles, what temperatures can raise, you know, a few degrees Celsius in that amount of time. What can you do? How can you guys, through the knowledge that you've gained today, what can today spur for you? So I hope there's a lot of things. You know, Annalie and Joni brought up at the beginning, get educated, get informed. That is at the most basic level. If you don't know about the problem, you don't know what you need to do, and you don't even know what your focus might be. So get educated, get informed, and seek out those opportunities for learning. You know, I'll make a plug for our newsletter. I put 1 to 2 emails out a month. They're pretty comprehensive. We serve as the hub for all the groups that are doing stuff, nonprofit, agencies, everybody. So I try and get everyone's events and opportunities into that newsletter so that you know, a lot of us just kind of stay in our lane, and I've got my fingers in as many pies as I can get into. You know, go to things like this, attend local presentations and workshops. You'll see a bunch of those in the newsletter. And then do what I did when I first started here. I didn't know anything. I grew up here. I probably should have known a lot more than I did. But this is what caught me up to speed. I went to the monthly meetings of anybody who would let me in. You know, and we'll talk about those guys in a second. We hold, our board meetings are open to the public every month. We do the first Tuesday of the month in this room. I give you guys pizza at 6, hang out for a half hour, and then we talk business, projects, funding, priorities, issues and concerns. Sometimes we go to 8:30. I like to wrap up by 7:30 or 8, get home. We've got more than 40 plus public, private, and tribal stakeholders that are all working on these issues. They're all doing different things. They might not all be doing things together. But the opportunities for you to get educated, to get involved, there's no excuses. There are so many groups working in so many different areas. I'll call out a few here. If you're in the Newburgh area, go hang out with the Steelheaders chapter. Those guys are amazing fishermen. They know a ton about the local area, but statewide they know a lot too. Really passionate folks. Here's a list of land trusts that are active in the area. It's a little tougher to get engaged with those guys. They just don't really have the staff capacity to interact or have a cup of coffee with you. They don't really have public meetings. That said, a phone call might not hurt to see if that's what your passion is land trust. These are the ones that have bits and pieces in our area. There's not really a good land trust presence right now, except the Soil Water District and the tribes. You know, George Fox and Linfield College, we're fully integrated into their environmental departments. We're working on habitat restoration projects with them. Great opportunities to hang out with their faculty and attend their workshops or symposiums. Of course, in this room, I think it's every 4th Thursday, you get the Native Plant Society meeting. Wonderful folks to connect with. They're working on a county roadside vegetation management committee and methodology. So they're trying to improve water quality by partnering with Public Works to control weeds that need to be controlled, save the natives that we can, and then hopefully replant with natives wherever we can too. Where County Parks is already planning big operations, regradings, we can integrate into those projects and, you know, work with them from the ground up so that the roadside that they're rebuilding is improving water quality from the get-go. So that's something that we're doing with the NPSO and the county and the Soil Water District. Outdoor education adventures, if anybody's got little kids or grandkids, This is a local LLC that spun off from our group. They worked with us as running our education programs for a couple years. So they do like no school days. They host camps up at Misker Park and Miller Woods, and Google these guys. They do some really incredible stuff. A lot of it's grant funded. But they love people that would like to get out with them and help do education. We have a really active, at least in Yamhill, I haven't been to the Polk ones, we have a really active small woodlands group. They meet at the OSU auditorium once a month, guest speakers, wonderful people. Go hang out with them. You don't have to be a small woodland owner to enjoy their company and learn from them. Farm Bureau, the Yamhill I think meets at one of the local Mexican restaurants once a month. Great opportunity to learn about what their issues are and what kind of things they're dealing with. Of course, there's a whole number of city and county governments that are all doing different things. These ones are a little trickier to get involved in. Watch the agendas. Watch the city council agendas. Watch their committee agendas. Look for topics that interest you. That's how I kind of pick and choose when I'm going to go to some of their meetings, and other than trying to do annual updates and reporting to them. And again, a plug for the county. Yamhill County is working on this roadside project. They also have a whole bunch of populations of that endangered Fender's blue butterfly and lupin. So they did a complete inventory of all known sites on their roadsides. They have a management plan that's updated every year, written by a butterfly professor, that says this is what you're going to spray, when you're going to spray it, this is what you're going to mow, when you're going to mow it. And so they're very actively managing these. And if you'd like to get involved in that, there's a lot of hand pulling that needs to happen, and you can contact me to get involved in that. Polk County is actually working on a ton of stuff in Salt Creek. If you live or work in Salt Creek, we can talk about that. They're mostly looking at infrastructure and flooding. All these special districts. The Yamhill Soil Water District meets every second Tuesday up at Miller Woods for a board meeting from 7:30 to 10. Amazing crew that they're running. You learn, probably the most I ever learn are at those monthly meetings. Polk also has monthly meetings the same second Tuesday of the month, but in the evening in Dallas. The location changes kind of often. The state and federal agencies and the tribes, sometimes those are hard to find opportunities to get engaged in, but again, look for hearings, look for committees, look for events that they're hosting. If you can't find anything that, through your searches, contact me and I'll get you in touch with our liaisons. If you're just dying to hang out with an ODA agriculture person, I'll get you that guy or gal, and you could spend a day together, drive around. And maybe that's a good suggestion. Do a half-day job shadow with any of these groups, and you'll be amazed at if it's a field day. Ask for a field day. And then, of course, if you have any background in technical or planning, it doesn't have to be natural resource related. If you're someone who's been on a nonprofit board before, get involved in our leadership team. So, again, our board meets monthly. Ours is the least requirements. You don't have to own land. You don't have to be a woodland owner. You don't have to be a fisherman. You just have to live, work, or volunteer within the Yamhill or Chehalem valleys in Grand Island, Lambert Slough. And you have to support, our mission that is voluntary-based, cooperative approaches to local natural resources. I can point you toward other groups that might be able to help you pursue a passion in more of, I'd call an advocacy or things of that nature. And we're starting this year to serve in that forum capacity a little bit better. Our goal is to have 4 technical meetings where we try and get all those partners together, whoever will come. We've got a lot of commitments so far. And we're going to talk about what are we all doing? Where is there overlap? What are the concerns that are coming that some of us are seeing but others aren't? Can we actually start planning a water quality monitoring program again and figure out funding for it? So those will be open to the public. If you've got some expertise, we might nudge you onto the table. Otherwise, you're welcome to be a fly on the wall and learn what you can. If you want to get out in the field with us, we've got a ton of activities going on. Habitat restoration. We just started a Cozine Creek initiative. We've got almost more than $70,000 for 4 years of weed kill and replanting across a little over 30 acres in town. The city parks is a big partner in that. We're doing half of Linfield College's 12 acres. We're doing about 6 acres. And so year round, you know, we're doing a lot of the weeding contract based, but there's a lot of stuff that's manual and volunteer based for weeding and maintenance. In the summer, it's not really a good time to plant. What you plant will die because we're not irrigating. So those are great times to do trash cleanups with us, get some waders on, we'll hop in, get your boots on. We also do like native seed collection. I just started doing some camas lily collection, trying to get into all sorts of different wildflowers, self-heal. So if you want to hang out and collect some seed. And then, you know, during the rainy season, we'll go out, we'll plant natives that we've acquired through local nurseries, donations, or we might even go out and do live cuttings off of, there's about a dozen species that you can do live cuttings off of for riparian areas. Here's that map. So yeah, here this blob is the Linfield property that we've got funding for 4 years. This is Ash Meadows Park. It's a little unnamed ditch of Cosine Creek that it's actually our most popular project right now because there's a little sidewalk that goes across it. And so there's people that walk that multiple times a day. So I've got big kudos on that one. Let's see, this is actually on the north branch, upstream of where we are now. We're working with an undeveloped city park. It's like a landlocked, undeveloped city park. It's not open to the public, it's not a trail system or anything. We're just trying to clean it up. And it's actually a continuation of our Shadowwood project. We worked on that several years ago. This is actually not something I did. This is a federal contract some odd years ago where they went in and did a huge planting and weed control project on the main river where Cosine and the Yamhill come together. A lot of wetlands in there they restored too. Excuse me. This little pink blob is the police station. And they already did a project back there. It needs some tender love and care, but they were trying to kill knotweed and some other really nasty weeds. We just got some funding to work with the Seventh-day Adventist Church and some neighbors in that area, and we're tying in the Seventh-day Adventist school, getting the school kids out to help with cutting the ivy off the trees and doing some hand pulling. The rest of it's contracted out. So a lot is happening in McMinnville. We've also got like 5 acres, 10 acres in Newport. If you want to look for fish, maybe plants aren't your game, you want to get some waders on, I got a whole slew of chest waders in the storage unit. Has anybody gone out with me for that in this room? Nika, Annalie, right on. Thank you guys for going. It's a hoot. You're probably going to get skunked if you go out with me for steelhead. They don't die after they spawn. They're in and out. They blend in. They don't change color. Incredibly elusive. I got an OSU student who snorkels. He sees them. He snorkels the pools and finds all of them. And he's actually the reason that we're doing this program. He came to us and said, I want to contribute, I want to build your capacity, this is what I care about. I work for ODFW on the summers. Thank you, Em. So really the best time to go out with us is coho season. They die, we find their carcasses, we cut them open. Sometimes you'll see live fish or just the reds. So we're tracking primarily distribution. Abundance, you'd have to go out every week to the same place and walk it preferably with the same crew member. We really just don't have the volunteer capacity to do abundance methods, but distribution we can do. And we've actually shown that spawning is happening way further up, miles further up, on a lot of these tributaries that ODFW didn't know that they were spawning in. The other big thing is water quality monitoring. Like I mentioned, we're doing pesticides. We also have a little stream flow gauge that we've learned how to use. So we're measuring the volume of the creek over every 2 weeks, March through October. Because a lot of times, it might not be that the pesticide concentration is higher, it might just be that there's not enough water. And it makes it look like a bigger concern than it might be. And then we'll go out and throw Hobo brand stream temperature probes in the creeks, and this is probably where we have the most opportunity to expand. When people ask me, you know, why aren't we doing water quality monitoring for pH, DO, bacteria, and all these other things? It's not really that the equipment's tough to get. We can coordinate that with agency partners that have that stuff sitting on shelves, right? E. coli and pesticides, it's a lab money issue. That might be tough, but anything that we can get instrument from an agency partner, and there's a couple people, 2-3 people willing to give a couple days a month throughout the year to go out with me and run that equipment in the creeks. That's how we can get more data than what we're getting right now. That's how we can get things on pH and DO, turbidity, all these other factors that I just can't do. It's just me in the office, so every person helps. So here's my finisher. I'm sorry I took so long. I will be available after. If you go down here to gywc.org/data, this presentation is already up there as a PDF. If you have questions, we can even do a coffee date. So thanks for your time.